term Al-Qaeda did not originate with the jihadists. It originated from Western students and professional. I would like to know your opinion of Sibel Edmonds' assertion that bin Laden was a U.S. employee up through 9/11. I would like to know your opinion of Professor Robert Lawrence, who you do note in your book, his position that many recent videotapes of bin Laden could not be bin Laden because the words are not flowery enough.
I'm sorry, I missed the first one.
First one is, my understanding is that the term Al-Qaeda was originated by Westerners and not by people who are jihadists.
The first time I ran across the word, sir, was in 1993 in an intelligence report that came out of Somalia, and it was spelled K-A-H-D-A-H, Qaeda. We didn't know what it was at the time. We didn't really know what it was for another couple of years, but clearly it didn't come from the United States or the West. It came from their own organization.
Okay.
And Miss Edmonds, her claim was bin Laden was in our employ.
Yeah, up to 9/11. She was a former FBI translator, most suppressed person in American history.
You haven't talked to me enough about it. Remember.
Oh, okay, she's the second one.
I'm kidding. For my sins, I worked on Osama bin Laden, either directly or indirectly, from December of 1985. I know for a fact we never had contact with him. And I know that primarily because I was responsible for making sure the agency covered its behind. If we had ever had contact with him, sir, we wanted to be able to tell the Congress that immediately. He was full of dislike for the Americans during the Afghan War. We never met him, and indeed probably didn't try very much. He was on the side of the angels. He was killing Russians. But the idea that he worked for the United States is a canard among many.
And Lawrence's first name is Bruce.
Bruce Lawrence. And your question regarding Bruce Lawrence?
My understanding is he said that the videotapes of bin Laden that we've seen in the West in recent years are not bin Laden because the language he uses is not flowery enough.
I would say two things on that. Mr. Lawrence must have a special channel in his mind to Osama bin Laden because there hasn't been a video for, someone can help me here, 4 or 5 years.
Whatever that one was.
There has been audios.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't say videos.
Yeah.
All the different tapes, including the one right before the election.
My own view on that is frustration even gets to the serene Muslim. If you read the statement he made on the eve of the 2004 election, it was decidedly shorn of flowery language, most quotations from the Quran or the Prophet's Sunnah, very direct, almost like, can't you guys understand English? And his texts since then, sir, have been very much different. Professor Lawrence is correct in the sense they're less flowery, less full of Quranic quotations than they were before 2004. But people adapt. If you're not getting your message through in flowery language, maybe you try something else. And we can discuss that back and forth, but I think the real proof of the pudding is, for whatever people criticize the U.S. government for, the National Security Agency can do voice prints of people that are very reliable. Each time he speaks, they do a voice print. And each time they've done it, it's been the same voice we heard since 1996. So I think Bruce Lawrence is right, but I don't think he's right in saying that it's not bin Laden talking.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hi. A friend of mine mother is an Egyptian journalist living in Egypt, and he was visiting her in late 2001. He said that the papers in Egypt and all over the Middle East were full of descriptions of Osama bin Laden's death in December of 2001. describing the funeral, and he has copies of those in Arabic, that he died of kidney disease
Yes.
then. And I wonder if you could address that, and also the issue of his kidney disease and the fact that he needed dialysis, and how he can be getting dialysis living in caves
Well,
to this time.
the whole, I think the whole issue of kidney disease began as a story and transferred into an urban legend. It's very hard for me to think of a man who has been drinking Sudanese and Afghan water for 25 years to have a very bad kidney condition. I can tell you what, and it goes directly to one of the reasons I wrote the book. When we were working Osama bin Laden, and there would be a videotape when he was still making videotapes, it would come out, and senior policymakers, Democratic, Republican, it didn't matter, didn't give a hoot in hell about what he said. But they would call doctors in from across the government, from across the country, and sit and watch that video like they were waiting for some revelation from Providence, to see if he had any lingering, any look of pallor, any discoloration, any type of movement problems that would relate to kidney disease. Those doctors never found anything then. And again, he may well have some kind of a kidney problem, but it's not serious. I think we're more or less grasping at straws there, hoping that, hoping he'll die of old age.
I'm sorry, I'd
And
like to present a
reports in
picture
the
of you
papers?
of some of the Kiemenbergen's article just recently in the Washington Post.
Yes, sir.
And here is a man dying of the disease, and look at his, this is the last real picture of the man.
Is that
I
right,
have
sir?
more copies of this for him.
Well, if somebody can have my copy if they'd like.
We always do.
What about reports of his funeral in December 2001?
In the state-dominated press of the Egyptian government. Again, you may be right, they may be right, but how do you explain voice prints on messages containing contemporary information if it's not him? Is it, maybe they are from beyond the grave, maybe he had a hook into Allah that was better than we thought. But you know, you can have all kinds of speculation, but as long as you have some kind of proof you can hang a hat on, I think you can operate on the most positive assumption, that that he's dead. There's no proof that he's dead. In fact, we had a statement last week, or 2 weeks ago now, about the French hostages in Africa. That again, NSA confirmed it was his voice. If all the tapes, ma'am, were just mutterings about war, about the Americans, about this, about that, with no current information in them, I guess you could make the argument that he recorded 3,000 hours of tape before he croaked. But as long as he's talking about current events, and as long as they've said the voice prints are him, it seems to me that we have to assume he's still alive.
I've always enjoyed listening to your analysis since you sort of went public and were around. Assuming everything you say is true, and there's no reason to think that it's not, what would that tell us about what our strategy should be instead of what our strategy is?
Our strategy really should be the truth. What I tried to do in the book is to point out that everything Mr. Clinton, Mr. Bush, and Mr. Obama have told Americans about what this war is being waged about is absent from the corpus of that material, with one exception, a short speech in December of 2001. There is no railing or ranting against women in the workplace. He doesn't call for the blood of Iowans because they vote in early presidential primaries every 4 years. There's no denunciation of Budweiser, no hate for freedom. So we are fighting an enemy that doesn't exist. We're fighting our presidents, our leaders in both parties want us to fight some sort of a nihilist madman. And we would be very lucky if we were, but we're not. Whether through sheer luck or a bit of genius, he's hooked on to 6 different American policies that are inextricably bound up with American domestic politics, and no president wants to talk about them.
But if Obama came to you and said, I agree with what you say, now what should I do
Tell the
about
truth.
that?
First, tell the truth to the American people. And I really think of the 6 things that he lists, the one we need to do first is something about energy. If we had done something in the last 40 years to free ourselves and more, even more today, our allies from our need for oil out of the Gulf, there's nothing on the Arabian Peninsula that's worth the life of a Marine except for oil. And if you freed yourself from oil, you wouldn't have to support the Saudi police state, which oppresses just as badly as the Mubarak government does. So that's a place to start.
And how about Israel?
Israel's got to go. You know, that's from my perspective, and you know, my opinion is worth exactly my opinion. But Israel is such a difficult question because even facts aren't facts. Israel, beyond a doubt, our relationship with the Israelis is a disaster for U.S. interests and policies in the Muslim world. Now, that's a fact. Whether you want to continue support for Israel or not is the discussion that needs to be made and decided not by me, but by Americans generally. But we never get that chance. And so now we're in the very ridiculous position of waiting for one morning to wake up and have 300 million of us at war with Iran because Netanyahu gets a little bit antsy. I said this morning, I was on TV, and I said, you know, what the president is not telling you is that Israeli security depends on tyranny. It depends on the tyrants who govern Jordan and Syria and Egypt. And the unfriendly email I've gotten in the last 6 hours has been extraordinary. But I thought that was just an obvious fact. So I think there's a whole number of issues. The support of, you know, how can the president, if he was honest, would say, we're sending your sons and daughters to die in Iraq to make sure the Saudi royal family isn't threatened by Saddam or anybody else, or oil continues to flow. But they're not going to say that. They're going to say liberty, democracy, freedom.
And women's rights.
I'm sorry?
And women's rights.
Yeah. If it's bad for a Marine to die on the peninsula, imagine being the parent of a young man or woman who died so Mrs. Mohammed can vote. There certainly has to be idiocy in that idea.
Could you comment on whether bin Laden's goals and their tactics have evolved over time? For instance, I've heard, I don't know if there's any truth to it, I've heard that he expected that after 9/11 that the United States would leave the Middle East entirely.
And it's a very strong argument. Peter Bergen makes it in his book. Larry Wright has made it in his book. But if you bother to go through what bin Laden says, he lured us into Afghanistan since the middle of early 97, repeatedly in public statements. He said, you know, I'll get you to Afghanistan basically, and then we'll put paid to you. And the claim that somehow he was shocked, like Claude Rains in Casablanca, that we came to Afghanistan. If it's true, it's because he thought we were too cowardly to do it. But did he want it? And was that his goal? Absolutely the case. And now we've lost that war. You know, although our generals and our presidents don't seem to think that the enemy has a vote or a voice, it's very clear that we've lost that war. And so when we leave there and when we leave Iraq, no matter how we dress it up, for the voters in our country, for the Muslim world, they beat the second superpower. So it's a bad thing. I think there's no evidence, at least within people who would have an ability to know that he really didn't expect us to respond. He hoped for us. I can tell you, I note in the book, on the 19th of September, 2001, after the attacks, he gave a short speech in which he was, I think, a little worried that maybe it didn't do the trick, because he goaded us and he said, we'll fight you here unless you're too cowardly to come. So I just don't buy the idea that he was surprised by our response.
As we approach the end of what might be called the 9/11 decade, what's your take on the current protests across the Middle East, given that the people who are protesting are bin Laden's key audience, but instead of fighting the long war, instead of planes into buildings, they're simply going into the streets and saying enough?
I think that the only way you can look at it is that he's got to be delighted with what's going on, in the sense that whether or not it's driven by Islam, and I think it's been very glib on the part of Western media to say that Islam doesn't have a part of it. It's aimed against the governments he has meant to destroy all along. Any government in Egypt that succeeds Mubarak, for example, is going to be less competent, less friendly toward Israel, less willing to keep its borders closed, and much less willing to kill its own people who want to go into Palestine to assist. So whether or not it's driven by religion, and I think it is almost inseparable from what these as I understand it, these protests and demonstrations from Tunisia to Jordan to Egypt are about is justice. The feeling that whether it's a bad economy, not enough work, or brutal security services, the people are being treated unjustly. And of course, justice is a key to understanding any sort of interpretation of Islam. So I think that the world is going exactly in the direction that bin Laden would want it to go.
Okay, two more questions.
Hi. I had occasion to hear a retired sergeant major who was a founder of the Army's Delta Force claim that bin Laden was killed in December 2001 at Tora Bora. He wasn't there, but his buddies were, and they say they caught bin Laden coming out of his cave to make a cell phone call and called it a fighter strike. And if that didn't kill him, if he got back in the cave, they bombed the hell out of that cave that night. That's the month that the obituary appeared in the Egyptian newspaper. I was going to ask you whether you think bin Laden's alive, but you already stated your position on that. So let me just state that a voice print being confirmed by the NSA is of about as much value as the CIA confirming that a tape is bin Laden, to my way of thinking.
Well, then maybe we should hire you, sir, I guess.
Please do.
Yeah. I'm sorry?
I think he's got a legitimate question.
What is the, I didn't understand the question. I thought it was an assertion.
My question was whether you think bin Laden's alive, but obviously you do.
Obviously, and culturally, there's a reason to think he's alive, sir. If he was dead, they would be both grieving and celebrating, and they would announce it. We have.
They did.
Pardon?
They did.
They never did, sir.
Mr.
You know-
Scheuer. Mr. Scheuer.
Wasn't
Ma'am.
an obituary in the Egyptian newspaper?
I can put your obituary in the paper tomorrow morning, sir. Right?
You could.
Yeah.
You would be mistaken, but what about the people who put that in the Egyptian newspaper?
Well, I think it's fair enough to say that if you think our security should be operated on best case scenarios, then we should all go home and forget about it.
I don't consider that a best case scenario. We've got a boogeyman here that we can keep alive for decades.
Mr. Scherer?
Yes.
If I assume that CIA analysts currently working on behalf of Americans in the CIA are as well informed as you are,
Better probably.
why aren't they informing our Middle East policy? And it's an insane policy we've had for 50 years. And I'm listening to you tonight and I'm saying to myself, you were part of the CIA. I would imagine that you would have created a sane Middle East policy that wouldn't harm the United States, that would have actually created a world view where we're not constantly creating this boogeyman. Why hasn't that occurred?
Barbara asked that, we were talking about that before the talk, and what I would say is that what I noticed after the end of President Reagan's administration, each of the successive presidents had less really interest in what the intelligence community said. They came to the office with a worldview is their own and really didn't like to have a lot of things contradict them. And this is a very hard topic to understand. You don't explain this in 30 minutes or 20 minutes, and they don't have a lot of time for you. And I would say a third thing is political correctness has paralyzed our government on certain issues. They don't want to hear, for example, that the Saudis are busy trying to radicalize our community of Muslims in the United States because the Saudis are their friends, either because they like them or they sell us oil or they buy our debt. Nothing goes to the White House or any senior level of the United States government that says Israel is a very bad idea. So you can have the best intelligence in the world, and I think we do. But the problem is not acquiring, the problem is pushing it vertically up and having someone listen to it.
So I have a friend who's retired CIA who's in his 80s who claims his perspective is he retired early because he said the CIA no longer had true Arabists on the desks covering the Middle East, that they had people who were co-opted by the Israeli lobby covering the Middle East.
I think that's not entirely true. I think there is, like in the CIA, like any other government organization, like any other organization in the country, you'll find people who think the Israelis are great and others who think they're not.
But would you agree that if you're an Arabist covering the Middle East desk, you should be neither Arab nor Jewish? That historically the CIA operated that way, that if you were Irish, you couldn't cover the Ireland desk? That that's not the case today?
You know, I would never encountered that in my career, ma'am. I don't think there's any reason a Jewish American can't cover Israel.
I'm Arab American, and I would say, as an Arab American, I would want a completely unbiased person covering the Middle East desk, not even an Arab American or a Jewish American.
I guess that's why they put Hungarian German like me in charge of this.
Okay, let's do one more question.
Ma'am.
I was in Israel as a student in 1949. Can you go to the mic?
You have to go to the microphone, Shirley, right over here, so people can hear you.
Right.
Thank you.
I was in Israel as a student in 1949. I will never forget the vigor, the enthusiasm, the vitality of young Israelis at work on a kibbutz that I visited. I personally am a Christian, but I have an enormous admiration for Jewish history, for the Old Testament, for the meaning of Judaism. What makes you so certain that Israel must be defeated?
I didn't say that, ma'am. What I said is the U.S. has no interest in whether Palestine or Israel survive. That's ultimately there's nothing we get from them that we need.
That's not exactly what you said.
Well, that's what I meant.
But you said Israel.
I said we should dump the Israelis.
No, that's not,
Why?
those were not your words.
Well, that's what I intended.
Notes, and you said Israel must go.
It must go. It must go. From our policy is what I meant.
Well, you should.
We were talking about policy. There's no reason to support the Israelis or the Palestinians. How insane is a
Do you
policy?
think that once Israel disappears, the Middle East becomes a democracy?
I'm not saying that. Israel can exist forever, but not with another American dollar.
I'm glad that you allow it.
Oh, you know, that's such a nonsense argument that people who support Israel make. No country has a right to exist. The United States doesn't have a right to exist. Bolivia doesn't have a right to exist. Germany doesn't. A country exists if it gets along with its neighbors, if it has a cohesive society, and if it has an economy that's viable. That's why a country exists. If a country should exist, we should all be rallying to Mubarak. We should be trying to restore the Soviet Union or the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. I've spent my whole life listening to that idiot argument and people saying that it comes from God or something. The idea that an American soldier or American dollar is spent on a country who says it belongs to the land because God gave it a deed 3,000 years ago, if that's what that country believes in, I think that's fine. But I don't want to support that kind of nonsense.
Okay, I think we got to stop
Middle East, and I was
No, I mean, that's the way it's changed. I'm moving, especially. The Navy.
What are you recording?
What's that?
What are you recording?
Just the entire event.
Is it for the store?
For the store? No. No, it's for my personal use.
Thank you for letting me review your book. Here's your present. Thanks. Well, thank you. I'm fine. Much shorter. Nice to meet you. I'll watch you. I appreciate it. Well, you're very kind.